Nope.
This is Sam Waxman speaking. It's one of the most exciting webinars that we've had for many reasons, but we'll be speaking with an extraordinary young woman who has done several things already in her short life of 35 years, I would think, by calculating it from your book. From being, Rogin has been a very successful news reporter with ABC in Washington and knows that system pretty well. We could probably talk about that another time. And more recently, a very respected and also admired and liked a producer at PBS, for the PBS News Hour, where she recently was interviewed by Judy Woodruff. And not only was she appreciated, but Judy really said some personal wonderful things about Ali. So it's great to have you. Now, Ali's done something quite extraordinary. She has put together what I consider one of the most compelling, educational, sincere, and emotional books on breast cancer. And I'll hold it up. This is the book that Ali has written, and it's just come out this year with really good reviews and an amazing reception thus far. It's called Beat Breast Cancer Like a Boss. Now, I'm going to try and get to that because it leads into a lot of discussion Ali and I will be having over the next 45 minutes. So with that, Ali, thank you for being on our webinar. I know you've been very busy, and pleased that you can speak out once again on this topic. And most things happen because people have a great desire to spend hours and hours and hours to get something that's impactful. And this is an impactful book. So what led you to put all your energy and emotion into this book?
Well, Dr. Waxman, thank you so much for having me tonight. It's wonderful to be with you and all of you who are joining us for this conversation. I was prompted to write this book following my own experience. I tested positive for the BRCA1 genetic mutation when I was about 20 years old. BRCA1 is a mutation that increases a woman's risk of breast cancer to the high 80s and her risk of ovarian cancer to the mid 60%. I decided, following my understanding that I had this mutation, I decided to have a prophylactic bilateral mastectomy right before I graduated college. And I was very at peace with that decision. It was the right thing for me. I didn't question it. But it was a bit hard for me to explain to some people why I was taking this preventative route so early. It was sometimes a challenge to explain to people the nature of the mutation. And this was a few years before Angelina Jolie came out and wrote about her experience with the breast cancer gene. A few years later, when she did share her story in the New York Times, I felt very personally validated and just a feeling of solidarity with her, that she had gone through this. She had probably asked herself the same questions that I had asked myself. And even though that part of my experience with BRCA was behind me, it still made me feel really good. And I realized that if I felt this way, reading Angelina Jolie's accounting, that other women might appreciate having a resource filled with stories from successful, in some cases famous women who had been through breast cancer. And so I set out to write the book. I made a bunch of cold calls and convinced enough amazing women to be part of this, that a few years later, here we are tonight talking about the finished product.
That is an amazing story. 20 years old, confronting a really intense experience, turning it around, and then going out to become almost a kind of like a spokesperson for this important topic. So first I'd like to ask you, going public with this at 20 and speaking with 30 really successful, visible women, how do you feel about people being public that they have breast cancer, which is still frowned upon by so many women, although we're going in the direction where people feel comfortable about talking about breast cancer? What's your feeling about that from the point of view of well-being and living with the whole experience?
I knew that I wanted to share my story, and that if sharing any part of my story, the good, the bad, the ugly, could help one other individual, then it would be worth it. I've been so incredibly lucky. I've had a charmed life, a very privileged upbringing, and this is frankly the biggest challenge that I had gone through up until now in my life. And so I knew that if I could help simply by sharing my story, that that was absolutely worth any sense of losing, a sense of privacy. I'm an open book. I find that it helps me talk about it if I'm talking with other women who are, considering prophylactic steps or have been diagnosed with cancer. And I think that's also the way a lot of the women in the book felt in being so open with me, with telling their stories, because they know the same thing. They believe the same thing to be true. Many of them did struggle for a time because they're in the public eye. They struggled with how much to share of their story at what time. Some of them were, in fact, outed essentially by journalists who wanted to get the scoop on their being diagnosed or going through treatment. That, of course, is a very difficult set of circumstances that I think a lot of us probably we don't have to deal with page 6 trying to break the news of our cancer diagnosis. But I do think it's very relatable to consider how many people you want to tell and when. So I do think that even though one common thread between all the women in the book and myself is that we all wanted to tell our story, we also did have to make choices about how much to tell and when, which is a very universal experience when it comes to breast cancer or any other type of cancer.
Why do you think that is more so with cancer? And use breast cancer as an example, which is not the major cause of mortality, such as cardiovascular disease. Somebody who's had a heart attack and have gone through a procedure or a stent or even bypass doesn't go around. Everybody knows about it, and they go on with their life. They don't label themselves. They feel they've been treated. Are we there yet with cancer where a person can feel that way?
I certainly don't think so. And I think there's a couple reasons for that, specifically when it comes to breast cancer. The reason why there is a bit of a stigma or a reticence to maybe talk about it so freely is, I think, has a lot to do with how the breast is such a part of the body that is tied up in conceptions of femininity and sexuality and motherhood, so that it's so much more than simply a part of your body. It is representative of all these other things, rightfully or wrongfully. So when you talk about something happening in your breast, number one, it's, as somebody in the book said, it's not like I'm talking about cancer in my thumb. I'm talking about my breasts, which can be very uncomfortable. And a lot of the choices that women make sometimes come under scrutiny because they are connected to these other elements that are associated with women. I've certainly gotten a lot of questions myself about not being able to breastfeed. And I mean, that's a totally different topic, but I do think that has to do something with the very specific place that breast cancer occupies in the discourse. The other factor, I think, is the fact that while treatments have come so far in the ability to make much of breast cancer a less fatal disease, and that's, of course, thanks in part to the hard work of the Waxman Foundation, we're still not there yet. There's still a relatively, I don't know if high would be the word that you would, as a doctor, would use, but there are still a lot of women whose cancer returns after a period of years. And so the fear of cancer at least for the women that I talk to, many of whom have been cancer-free for 15 years now, it never really goes away because they are conscious of the chances of recurrence. Then, of course, there's the metastatic community, which in so many ways feels marginalized from the conversation about beating breast cancer, because while there have been incredible progressions that can extend a woman with metastatic breast cancer's life, there is still no cure. So I think there are still different sections of the breast cancer community which feel very alienated from the concept of beating breast cancer, which is why I talk in the book about how I don't conceive of beating breast cancer to simply be about going into remission and remaining cancer-free.
Right. So I often use the concept that if you've been successfully treated for cancer, that should be the definition rather than being a survivor. What do you think of that kind of mindset, going from the survival mode to just feeling comfortably, I've been successfully treated for cancer, and going on with your life like I've been successfully treated for cardiovascular disease? Well, somebody who has cardiovascular disease successfully treated has the same long range, even more so, of a life to think about. Whereas most people who get successfully treated with cancer are free of cancer, most. And even in breast cancer, we're talking about a huge number of women at the early stage, 90%, 90 or more, or
My cat.
are successfully treated, much more successfully treated than they are for heart disease, yet they still think they're survivors. Do you think that's a mindset that is unique for this disease because of the past history, and we're not catching up with the present and future?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And I do think that the notion of survivorship and what it means is a bit outdated because, as you said, it has so much more, the metrics of success have to do with a lot of different, the terminologies just don't match up. When you talk about being successfully treated for cancer, that is a very different thing from declaring, I've survived this. It's not necessarily something that really fits that nomenclature. So I do believe that when I talk about what it means to beat breast cancer, of course that's the name of the book, so it's a phrase that I've thought a lot about. I think of it more in terms of the daily struggle, which can begin the day a woman finds something irregular in her breast or in a mammogram, and it doesn't necessarily have an end date, because even once you finish treatment, you're still dealing with some of the mental challenges that come with the diagnosis. You're thinking about, it does take a lot of exertion to, maintain your mental health following a diagnosis. So I think of beating breast cancer as something that is a daily struggle and should be celebrated as a daily triumph.
Well, it's evident in your book and in the 30 stories that you have presented that there is this emotional part, this struggle part. So you formatted your book to put beat cancer as a boss, meaning that you want to be the boss and control your own outcome, right? So you start out in 3 different sections to each story. The first is the diagnosis, right? Now, I've been treating breast cancer for years and years and years. And when I've seen a person, they usually already know their diagnosis. And if they relate it to me a week later, or even 10 years later, or 20 years later, that diagnosis is vivid, vivid, vivid in your mind. How do you deal with that, that instant, that day, that nightmare? What's the advice you have? Because you really stress that with almost every story, the diagnosis.
Yeah, it's something that I think, because in a lot of cases, you don't know it's coming until it's actually happening to you. And of course, that can be extrapolated to any cancer or any diagnosis of anything that comes as a surprise, or maybe even not a surprise, but just the confirmation of it is shocking. And there's sort of a period that exists, I think, of a fog where a woman has received her diagnosis, hasn't figured out yet what she should do or what she wants to do. So it can be a very, very scary time. And many of the women have different ways of dealing with it. A lot of them benefited from having someone else there with them when they went into, for example, receive the results of a biopsy. There are some cases where women were asked to bring someone with them, and that may have hinted to them what the news was going to be, but at least somebody was there to help them along. It's a really challenging time. It's a very unique moment in the breast cancer journey that I think that can be really, really hard to grapple with. And there are a lot of stories in the book of women struggling in those first few days. But luckily, what they all have in common is that that sense of a fog does dissipate once you decide, these are the doctors I want to talk to, this is the course I want to take. So it is something that goes away. And there are various strategies in the book for dealing with it.
Right. So that is a really important moment. Is there any simple way of suggesting to the people listening in, how do you deal with that first knowledge? How should it be given to you? Who should give it to you? And in what setting?
I definitely think that for doctors who are listening, across the board, the thing that the people I talked to wanted to know was, give it to me straight and don't try to jargon around it. There were many cases where the patient would enter the room with the doctor would hold up some slides or some images and talk about what you're seeing and use some language that would go over the patient's head. And a couple women had to say, are you telling me I have breast cancer? Because the terminology that was being used was simply not being direct. And most people, I have found, at least in reporting out this book, want someone to be direct to them. They want to know what is happening with their body, and they can take the news. It's much harder to try to decipher what a physician is telling you if it's not clear and blunt, especially following, especially if the news is something as life-changing as a diagnosis. The other piece of advice, again, that would apply to the patient is, and this goes for all the appointments, bring somebody with you, because once you've received a diagnosis, it's likely that you're not going to be able to pay attention to what is being thrown at you. So bring somebody who can help ask those questions, who can take notes for you, and who can be there to wade through the mental fog that you might find yourself in.
That's very helpful, Ali. I think that's right on. The next part of most stories you call the battle.
Yeah.
So battle really has a kind of connotation. So what are you creating with that word, and how is that useful?
Yeah, it's a good question because it is very controversial. It is something that people have very strong feelings about. The battle terminology I have found useful in my own experience. It has been useful in the experiences of a lot of the women that I chronicle. But of course, a lot of people find that that's not helpful, because if you're talking about going into battle, in battles, there are winners and losers. And so if you're talking about, entering a battle and you die of breast cancer, does that mean you lost your battle? I think that's an unfair proposition. And so that, again, is why when I talk about battling cancer, And again, recognizing that that is a word that is rife and not everybody is going to agree with my using it. So I understand that. But when I talk about it, it's in the context of the daily struggle. It's in the context of getting through each and every day. And how do you do that? And what do you do to maintain a sense of control when it feels like everything is spiraling out of control? What does it mean in terms of maintaining relationships with those you love, even as sometimes breast cancer changes those relationships? A lot of the coping mechanisms that the women in the book describe, don't seem like they're very battle related. They could be as simple as, taking a walk down the driveway with a friend. But that to me is something that represents a small victory, because it means that you're going along with something that you enjoy doing and you're trying to not focus on breast cancer. And it's a challenge because so many women, breast cancer transforms who they are. It is something that they believe shapes their character, but they don't want it to define them. And I think that's also part of the tension that exists when we talk about a battle in this context.
Well, I think that's a great explanation with the care that there are no losers.
No.
In my opinion, I think we all have to go through that experience in life some way, and it's the matter of feeling that you're doing everything you can possibly do to get through that. And you don't measure it life or death, but measure the whole ability to deal with it. So, and that's what comes through in all of these stories. Getting through that time only leaves you a lot of time to deal with the results of that time, which you call the comeback, right?
Yeah.
So that's as important as anything else. No matter how successful that treatment may have been or that battle, you still have to come back, whether you're on the offense or on the defense, whatever. And so what do we learn from comeback?
Yeah, the comeback session is basically about lessons learned and advice that these women can provide to others. It's about how they got back to normal life as it, in a sense, following, whether it's after treatment is done or if they have moved officially into remission. A lot of it has to do with the way that your perspective on things changes when you've gone through something like this, because many of the people in the book, and again, I say women, but of course, men can get breast cancer as well. It applies to trans people, non-binary people. Unfortunately, in this version of the book, I was only able to speak to women, but I do hope to remedy that in the future. But it is something that even if you don't want it to, it has the potential to change who you are and how you see the world. A lot of women report, while they were going through chemotherapy, they developed a renewed appreciation for walking outside and seeing that the sky is blue and appreciating a bird singing in a tree, because you really do, your life gets reduced down to very small things when we're all living these big lives, these digital lives. So it really forces you to look inward and, again, the comeback section is also a lot about women talking about how this disease doesn't define them, and as more time goes by, they forget details of their experience, which is part of the beauty of time. But at the same time, it does change who they are, and a lot of times it changes them for the better. That doesn't mean that anybody is grateful that they had breast cancer, but they are grateful for some of the things that experience taught them. And I think that's a fundamental part of living a full life, is learning from the things that happen to us.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the role of the physician in the battle and in the comeback, all the way through all parts. there didn't seem to be much of that stated by the interviews. And either because maybe it was a subject that was not really that important in the interview, or it just wasn't that important. And as a result, it was barely touched on. So we could either start with you or others that you have spoken to in the book. How important is that relationship?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I do wish that I had spent more time looking at the patient-doctor relationship, because it is essential. I mean, it is the most important relationship. I think more important probably than even the one that you have with the people closest to you who are helping you get through it. I would say that all of the women I talked to felt it was extremely important to choose a doctor or set of doctors that they resonated with on a human level. And when I do talk about doctors in the book, it's always from the perspective, the context of the patient. So of course, this is a very patient-centric point of view, but the things that we talked about were selecting your team. And if you don't feel a good vibe from the first doctor you go to several more. A lot of the women reported not really feeling comfortable with even the most prestigious doctors in the area. They said, you know what, I don't get a good vibe from that person. And that when they did go to somebody that they really connected with, obviously none of them are going to quacks, but they allow their own gut feelings about physicians to really guide their decisions, because I do believe, in my experience, I had an incredible medical team who I felt very close to. And in fact, my my oncological surgeon read the book over for me before I published it for medical accuracy. And I just think the world of her and my plastic surgeon. Another thing that I do touch on in the book, and again, there's so much in the patient-doctor relationship that I don't delve into, other than to say that I think there are some negative experiences reported on in the book about people who felt that their doctors were not giving them all the information that they needed, or were leaving some details on the table, or were advising them, in a way that they didn't want to go. And that leads me to talk about, being your own best advocate in a medical setting, which I do think is very important. But on the flip side of that, I'm very sympathetic to the doctor's point of view that, doctors are human. And so if there is something that a patient feels like they're not getting a full explanation of, or that there's a decision that they disagree with, it's usually not because the doctor is a bad person or anything else. It's because, there are as many steps and decisions that a patient has to make, a doctor has to make them too. And you're treating every patient differently, and you're doing what you determine is in their best interest. But of course, there are always things that, intangibles that can come into play that might end up with a patient feeling like the doctor did something that they didn't like. And so there's always two sides to the story. And it is something that I do wish I had devoted more time to in the book.
That's another book.
Exactly. That's
Volume 2.
Yeah, volume 2 for sure.
So you had a really select group of 30 outstanding women in their pursuit of career, active and successful. There were two aspects of this question, and this may be the last question that I'm going to ask, and maybe you can come back and ask me some questions. They're characterized by one being well-known and with visible celebrity, and the other, they were on the young side, most of them. So my question is there any difference in a woman that's a celebrity versus a woman that's not a celebrity on how you can beat cancer as a boss? And the second is, does a woman that's over 50, and that's a person where breast cancer is starting to peak. That's where most of the women will be, how they deal with the loss of a breast, the image situation. So let's take the first one, if you would, celebrity versus non-celebrity.
I do think that there are unique parts of being a celebrity and a celebrity with cancer that a normal person doesn't have to think about. Number one is, strangers coming up on the street and trying to give you a hug or something because they know that you're going through or have recently gone through. It's a level of intrusion that I think a lot of celebrities were concerned with at first, but ultimately came around to because it ends up being able to relate to someone on the level of a cancer or other medical experience can be very, very valuable for both people. But it can be a challenge. Where there are similarities, though, is again in determining how open you want to be and when about your own experience. You don't have to be a celebrity to grapple with how many people in your workplace do you want to know, how many members of your family, what about your friends, the emotional burdens of sharing a diagnosis with other people and then having to deal with their reactions to it. Because a lot of times what happens is you tell somebody I have cancer and they, start crying or something. And then you end up having to convince them that, no, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be fine. And that can be its own really, difficult emotional burden to bear. And a lot of people don't want to have to deal with that. So that is something that is both unique about a celebrity, but also universal. Another thing, though, that I think is essential to talk about is the fact that most of the people in this book are well off. And so they could afford the best care. They didn't have to worry about whether they could afford to take time off work or whether they could afford transportation to get to all their appointments. Could they afford the best care? These are all people who, of course, have great health insurance, but could pay for the out-of-pocket costs associated with, excellent plastic surgery if that's the direction that they took. And that is inherently a challenge in writing a book mainly about famous people. I tried to remedy that as best I could. I included the story of an incredible survivor named Molly McDonald, who started a group called the Pink Fund, which specifically provides small loans to people going through breast cancer who are able to pay for their medical costs, they're insured, but who might need to take time off work that is not covered by their federal family leave, or who are behind on paying for rent and their car payments because they work an hourly job and they're no longer bringing in those paychecks. Groups like the Pink Fund do exist, and they are there to help those people who don't have access to, who might be insured, so they're not, below a certain level where the government safety net comes into play, but they are working and yet get caught in the cycle of financial toxicity. So that is something that I did think was very important to address, which is something that these celebrities didn't have to worry about, but of course is something that most other people in this country and in fact in this world do have to deal with. So at this point, I'd love to turn the tables on you, Dr. Waxman. And before we get to questions from the audience, I'd like to ask you a bit about breast cancer from your perspective. And the first thing I want to ask about is, your foundation obviously has been doing incredible work in this space for a long time. So what sort of breast cancer research does your foundation do?
Well, thank you very much. I'm happy to answer that. The major problems we have in going forward to really eradicating this disease is a better understanding of how it happens and how to prevent the happening from happening. And so I think we've made a huge step forward in people like yourself, where early identification of a predisposition to the disease, such as family histories, people being educated, people recognizing that if they find out there's a breast cancer thing going on in their family, going back, they should be aware of that. They should be educated. It's not necessarily a foundation thing, but that is the message that you're giving us so well, that early recognition of a predisposition genetically, and certainly the BRCA1 and 2 gene has been a great discovery, and it has a much higher effect in the Ashkenazi Jewish population, 50 times more. And fortunately, it's accountable for about 8% of breast cancer. So that is something that early detection and knowing what to do, education. The foundation has been interested in 2 or 3 important parts to the question of prevention. And one of them is prevention of spread, and the other is prevention of the increasing incidence of breast cancer. It is increasing in this country and in the world. While we are curing more women when they have the disease, the number of women that are going to have cancer, it just keep going up. One of the major reasons is aging. As I alluded to, aging is what most women start to peak up with breast cancer over the age of 50, which is well past childbearing age. There's hardly any real reason for breasts at that time from the point of view of nursing, or the ovaries and uterus for reproduction. So one has to wonder why, if they're not needed that much, maybe they're more prone to, if we're living so much longer, the stresses on those organs may start to cause problems in normal control of normal growth at the gene level. So one of the things the foundation major program is that we have started an international program on trying to understand the link between age and cancer, aging being the major risk factor for cancer. And we're doing that in this country with the National Institutes of Health and partnerships with other important international programs. And so that's something the foundation is investing heavily with our brain trust. The second thing is, how do you prevent return? How do you prevent metastasis? That's an incredibly complex problem and every person's fear once they've had cancer. So that's why you're left with this idea that, you know, what's happening is that when's the shoe going to fall down? Well, truth be said, anytime you have cancer, there's a risk for recurrence. On the other hand, most people don't recur, fortunately, if they're diagnosed early. So we have a very intense program and look at what are some of the characteristics of a cancer cell that makes it more apt to recur. And that could be done now at the beginning of the diagnosis. So the diagnosis should include the genes that are highly suggestive of recurrence. And more this is happening with every tumor where there's a genomic evaluation, and particularly in breast cancer, where every tumor goes and gets something like oncotype, where genes looked at to see what is the chance of it coming back, and then are treated accordingly, maybe with much less treatment if there's a low chance, or no treatment, or a lot of treatment if there's a bigger chance. And so the foundation is going in the direction of trying to understand how circulating cancer cells, which are commonly there, even though you may never get sick from it, that risk is there, what makes those circulating cancer cells come back and how to prevent it. And the other is another unmet clinical need, and that is trying to figure out how to really help a woman with triple negative breast cancer. This is more commonly associated with BRCA1 and 2. It's more common in African-American women, and it tends to be in younger women. And our goal is to change the behavior of the cancer cells from triple negative so that they can be reprogrammed and behave like the less aggressive, well-differentiated form, lose their ability to invade, lose their ability to metastasize, and put them with a more targeted treatment. And so those are the major way we're going at it. We have several groups here in the United States and elsewhere working, being supported by the foundation.
That's amazing. They all sound so incredible and so critical, so important. So you laid out some wonderful examples of where you're going in terms of research, but in recent years, of course, there's also been lots of innovations and breakthroughs. So what have you been tracking in the breast cancer space in terms of major successes?
Well, we can track it by the decreasing mortality. I mean, the data is there. I mean, this was not a given until the last decade or two. So that is incredibly important. Why did that happen? Well, I think the first thing is early diagnosis, better imaging, making women more aware of the need to do that. I get perturbed by there's a lobby of trying to decrease the number of mammograms. Well, that almost is saying to women, you don't need a mammogram. Well, I think that is faulty. It really has to do with, at a particular age, is there a history that you should have a mammogram even though you're 20 years old, right? So early diagnosis has been critically important. Secondly, appropriate treatment based on the gene makeup of the tumor. I said that it's really personalized treatment, so to speak. Breast cancer is so many different varieties, so many different gene situations, most of them doing something that wrong and is the cause of that problem. And so the more we know about it, and so whole genomic sequencing of biopsies and tumors themselves is critical in treatment management. And it's not that long ago when we were talking about doing the whole genome sequencing and it cost millions of dollars. Today, you can have it done in a very brief time in hundreds of dollars. So the technology is become more commonplace, and every person who has breast cancer or any cancer should have their tumor sequenced, looking for mutations that will give you guide to treatment, and also looking for gene expressions that will give you prognosis that you can't see under the microscope. So I think that that's incredibly important. I would just say one more thing. We are two therapies that are making a difference more and more and have to get better yet. The treatment of breast cancer with hormonal therapy it's been around for 60 or 70 years. It's still critically important in saving life, and we shouldn't forget that. And we keep improving upon that receptors, like the HER2 receptor. They make a difference in selective minimally toxic treatments. And finally, there is a future for immune therapy in breast cancer. We're not there yet in breast cancer. It's still early days, but look for that being an important part in what we call control of disease that may have already spread. And so those are the things I'm optimistic about.
So I'm very curious. This next question is a bit, it's related to me, but what would your advice be for someone like me who has the BRCA gene or any other genetic mutation that corresponds to breast cancer? What should somebody who's found out they have this mutation know from your perspective?
Well, you and I could discuss that for another hour, couldn't we?
Yeah.
And you would probably know more about it than me because you are an educated consumer that's lived through this. So I'll try to simplify it with you. It's already been shared with me that your father, who's public about this is, I think we can talk about this. Am I right?
Yes.
Okay. A well-known man, who is the carrier for the BRCA1. So many times the public just doesn't know. They think about a woman passing it on. So understanding that a carrier can be a woman or a man, and understand that either a woman or a man can be threatened by having the mutation. In the case of your father, it turned out to be prostate cancer. In my opinion, we're finding more and more men with BRCA mutations associated, or BRCA-like mutations associated with prostate cancer, which is an interesting story by itself. In an individual like yourself, you're already planning your life. You know what you have to do. You feel confident in what you've done. You understand it. You've gone through the emotional evaluation of risk benefit. I always talk to people, and I have had this conversation many times. This is a big deal. This is one of the bigger deals you've ever made. So when you make that deal, you better be sure, as much as you can, you're balancing out the risk benefit, right? And so you've done that, and you've gone ahead and taken the first step. Now, as you know, one has to be aware that in your case, and again, it's education, that you know that BRCA1 is still a danger to you. That mutation is still a danger to you in other forms of cancer, and that is a lifelong risk. So how that you deal with that is planning. And if it's a target that you have to be concerned about dealing with at a certain age, you deal with it. And you're happy that you've done it. It's that one less thing, one less bridge you have to cross, and you cross it with confidence. You beat it like a boss, if I may take your term.
Right.
Right.
What a brilliant phrase.
And the last thing is, which is probably one of the more sensitive things, how do you tell your relatives? How do you tell them, listen, you better be tested for this? And how do you deal with those that don't in your own mind and say, oh my God, why don't they do it? Well, you don't beat yourself up. Don't beat yourself up, because they're not going to do it anyhow, but you've done your best to tell them. And then also, if someone does get tested, go with them. Make sure that you're there when they get it. You be the example. So putting all these things together, we have to be grateful for the science that identified your mutation in your cells. Have to be grateful to Mary Claire King for doing that. And great science really is the key to curing cancer.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, we talked earlier about the patient-doctor relationship, but I want to ask you, as a doctor, how can a doctor contribute to a person's fight? And how can a patient's relationship with a doctor help optimize their experience and their outcomes?
Well, I'll try and make it briefly. I think that first contact is so critical.
Mm.
And that means you're with this person, and that person, whether it be a woman with breast cancer, is the only person in the world that matters at that moment. And that person has to feel the same way about me. They have to feel, I always use this analogy, if you're on a rope and going up a cliff, and I'm holding the rope for you, you got to be sure I'm not going to let go. And that's the thing I'd like to get across in the initial part of it. Mm. That's getting past the diagnosis. The second part of it is making people believe they can really do it and come out strong. And one thing I often would tell, particularly a woman, about hair loss and things of that nature is, remember, look the way you look now, all the way through it. Be vain, and do whatever you have to do to stay that way. And that is very powerful. And lastly, really trying to answer every question that's asked. And finally, one more, taking criticism. Allow that person to come back and if they have a problem in the way I am working or my staff is working, I want to know it. Because if you don't, they will not trust you. And trust here is key.
Absolutely. And I just, your point about being vain, stay that way is so critical. So many of the women in the book, especially Jennifer Griffin, who's a Fox News correspondent, she talked about how she felt wonderful she put on a full face of makeup for every chemotherapy appointment. She would put on very comfortable clothes that made her feel good, but that there is a real connection between looking your best and feeling your best. In fact, Avon has an incredible program called Look Good. I think it's called Look Good, Feel Good. And it's not about being superficial. It's about feeling like yourself and like you're comfortable in your own skin, which is so critical. Jesse, if we have any questions, I would think that now is the time we should get to them, but if not, I'm sure we can continue the conversation.
Thank you, Ali. Yes, ladies and gentlemen in the audience, there are two ways you can submit a question. You can raise your hand and we'll unmute you and you can speak your question, or you at the bottom of your screen, you can hit the Q&A field and type in your question. So we'll give them a minute or so to raise their hand or type the question. If there's anything you want to add, Ali or Dr. Waxman.
Yeah, I would say as we're waiting for questions to be compiled, you mentioned that BRCA is still a risk to me. And so the next gauntlet in this, I've been lucky, I've been able to sort of only think about it on my terms for 10 years. But now I'm having to think about the prophylactic oophorectomy, which I'm going to need to have. I'm 33 now, actually, 34 in June. So this is something that it's been recommended to me to happen by age 35. And so there are a lot of questions about fertility and going into early menopause that I'm grappling with now. So I'm looking to sort of return to the community that I've been a part of and ask for advice.
Yes. Again, it's risk benefit, like most things in life. Understand the risks and the benefit. There's hardly anything that you could not overcome by having your ovaries removed and your fallopian tubes.
Yes.
You could still, as you know, harvest the egg and freeze it and make it available, right?
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
So you can reproduce.
Yeah.
Early menopause is complicated, but generally with some real determination. What are the determinations, in my opinion? Very straightforward. Exercise, 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 eat well, stay trim, and be vain. And of course, be aware that it should not have any, best to my knowledge, it should not take away the joy of life, the joy of sex, the joy of relationships. Certain things may make things more difficult. Recognize what those difficulties are. They can be overcome.
Absolutely.
So the benefit is walking away from ovarian cancer. We can't diagnose it early enough. We just can't do it. If the day can't, it's not like getting a mammogram or an MRI. This is a hidden bomb. You use it in your books. Some of the women have used it in your book. Sooner or later, those ovaries won't be of any need to you. And what do you want them for, right? If anything, I'm always particularly happy when a woman says, I've got cysts, I got that, I'm 48 years old. Should I just take the cyst away? I said, no way, get rid of it. So I think the decision can be made with confidence.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, that's how I've approached every other aspect of this. Just get rid of it. Put the worry out of your mind. That's definitely how I approach most things in life. I'm a proactive person, and I have been lucky in that I've had a set of solutions that are easily accessible. That's not always a given when it comes to dealing with cancer. Some people have it much harder than I did. Luckily, I was able to say, I can just remove my breasts and remove my risk relative to the average person. And so I really do view that as a blessing. And I view ovarian cancer the same way. It is actually the disease that killed my aunt on my dad's side, which it was sort of the canary in the coal mine for us all getting tested. And so I know how serious it is. I know that it's not something to mess around with. So it's a daunting thing that I'm facing. But I do think that it's another part of my story that if I'm open about it and transparent, it can hopefully help other people going through the same challenges.
But I think we're getting to that time where I just like to sum this up. It's a pleasure getting to know you and talking with you. And I think you have a lot to offer, not just this great book published by Diversion, something close to my heart. And
my favorite publishers in the world.
And you have a lot more to do with this. I think you really could be a spokesperson. I hope you work closely with the foundation going forward. I mean, I feel comfortable that I can pick up, drop you an email and say, Ali, let's do something that would get the word out for something. And so that's a big plus. And I'm sure those who listened in really got a good, solid understanding of this from you. And looking at you right there, you look terrific. And that's a big message in itself. And so on behalf of the foundation, I really appreciate your time. Jesse, thank you for being such a good host. And I gather this will also be aired on our website in the future, and we're trying to get this circulated because I do think this was a very worthwhile conversation. So I thank you so much.
I completely agree.
Right.
Thank you, Dr. Waxman. Thanks, Jesse. Thanks to everybody who tuned in.
Right.
Thank you for tuning in. For more information about the book, visit diversionbooks.com. And for more information about the Samuel Waxman Cancer Research Foundation, please visit waxmancancer.org. Thank you.
Bye.